Okay, so picture this. How could a localized ceasefire violation in just one country somehow trigger a massive global economic crisis? I know, it sounds exactly like the setup to a geopolitical thriller, right? But according to some really intense recent analysis, it's actually a very real scenario the world is staring down in the summer of 2026. A broken truce in Lebanon basically ripples outward, shifting from these isolated regional skirmishes into an absolute chokehold on the entire global economy.
Welcome to today's Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really intricate geopolitical breakdown by Khalid Massoud. It's titled The Brink of a Regional Abyss. Massoud maps out this rapidly escalating 2026 crisis involving Iran, Israel, and the US. And he essentially breaks down how these isolated military triggers snowball into a wildly complex global emergency. It's a lot to wrap your head around, but we're going to go through it step by step.
And here's exactly how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the catalyst. Then, we'll dive into Operation Nasr. Next up, the global power chessboard, followed by the economic fallout, and finally, we'll wrap things up with the push for diplomacy.
All right, let's jump right into part one, the catalyst, ceasefire violations.
To really grasp how this whole thing blows up, we gotta look at the immediate spark. Now, Massoud's analysis notes that the broader conflict actually traces back to joint strikes on February 28th that were aimed at regime change in Tehran. But the immediate, literal spark, that ignited in Lebanon. The analysis highlights this severe breakdown in a ceasefire agreement over a 3-month stretch, specifically from March to May of 2026. Instead of a pause in the fighting, there were continuous, documented military operations in southern Lebanon by Israeli forces. We're talking about intense airstrikes with significant civilian tolls, happening almost daily, completely stalling out any kind of peace process.
But if you look closely at the data, the author pinpoints one specific tipping point for Tehran. Monitoring bodies actually documented the use of artillery-fired white phosphorus munitions dropped directly over residential homes. This happened specifically in a village called Arnon. And for the Iranian leadership, this persistent use of incendiary weapons on civilian areas, combined with the continuous bleeding of Lebanon, basically signaled that diplomatic pathways were deliberately blocked. According to the source material, this is what ultimately forced their hand.
Which brings us to part two, Operation Nasr's regional risk.
So how does Tehran respond to those violations? Well, it wasn't just more of the same. It was a massive, high-stakes strategic shift. You see, in past exchanges, their tactics usually relied on utilizing proxies or hitting peripheral assets, basically indirect shadow wars. But Operation Nasr, which translates to victory, by the way, completely flips the script. It marks a total transition to direct, conventional ballistic missile strikes launched by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. This isn't a proxy skirmish anymore. It's straight-up conventional warfare. And the targets? They aren't random at all. They are aiming squarely at Israel's Tel Nof and Nevatim air bases. Massoud explains that the explicit goal here is to cripple the very backbone of Israel's aerial warfare and nuclear delivery capabilities. That is a massive escalation, striking right at the heart of critical military infrastructure.
And of course, an attack of that magnitude is going to trigger an immediate domino effect. The analysis warns of a huge probability of regional spillover, basically resulting in a synchronized, multi-theater war. The anticipated responses? You've got Israel launching deep penetration airstrikes and intense cyber warfare to cripple Iranian infrastructure. In turn, Hezbollah is expected to unleash its full arsenal of precision-guided missiles. Meanwhile, Iraqi militias and the Houthis synchronize their attacks on U.S. military assets and commercial shipping. It's a terrifying chain reaction, literally across the board.
Let's move on to part three, the global power chessboard.
Zooming out for a second, with a multi-front war erupting, how do the world's superpowers react? Well, Massoud outlines how Washington, Moscow, and Beijing are all rapidly recalculating their strategic positions in real time. Let's start with Washington. The U.S. faces what the author calls the dilemma of entanglement. Because they already launched nearly 900 sorties alongside Israel back on February 28th, the U.S. is politically bound to defend Israel. But the Pentagon is deeply, deeply wary of being dragged into yet another endless Middle Eastern war. So they're in this incredibly tight spot, desperate to deter Iran, but without crossing any red lines that would force sustained, direct U.S. combat. Then, over in Moscow, it's a completely different story. Russia is engaging in opportunistic realpolitik. It's actually a pretty wild strategic paradox. Massoud argues that a prolonged conflict actually serves Russian interests perfectly.
Think about it. It keeps the U.S. militarily and diplomatically distracted, and all the chaos drives up global energy prices. That directly benefits the Russian economy, which is currently operating under heavy Western sanctions. So they'll support Iran just enough to bleed American resources, but they're going to carefully avoid any direct clash with the U.S.
And finally, there's Beijing, stepping in as the pragmatic mediator. China's motivation here is almost entirely economic. Because they are so heavily reliant on Gulf energy imports, the 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis poses a massive threat to their energy security. They literally cannot afford for that strait to close. So Beijing is highly motivated to leverage its ties with Tehran to push for an immediate ceasefire, while scrambling to insulate its own economy from the shock.
All right, part 4, the economic fallout. So we've mapped out the military chess moves, right? But what does this actually mean for everyday people? The analysis walks us step by step through the collapse of the global supply chain. It all kicks off with blockade diplomacy, choking off global transit points. That creates the massive 2026 Strait of Hormuz crisis, essentially weaponizing energy. With vital waterways closed, we immediately see severe shortages, not just of oil, but also key fertilizers and agricultural products. And the inevitable result of all that? A vicious brand new wave of global inflation.
Which really makes you stop and ask a very crucial and frankly empathetic question. Who actually pays the highest price for this man-made shock? I mean, wealthy nations might be able to dip into their strategic reserves, but who truly bears the brunt of this?
The stark conclusion drawn by Masood is that the global south pays the heaviest toll. Developing nations, with the author specifically pointing to Pakistan as a prime example, are disproportionately punished by a conflict they have absolutely no stake in. They get plagued by surging oil prices that just wreck their balance of payments, sky-high domestic inflation, and soaring costs for essential imports. It's the kind of shock that threatens to push millions into poverty and derail years, if not decades, of economic development.
And that brings us to our final section, part 5, the push for diplomacy.
Because of this sheer economic devastation, the author makes a really urgent final plea for immediate conflict resolution. The absolute core thesis of Masood's text is this true conflict resolution requires moving away from the paradigm of military adventurism and towards a framework of inclusive, pragmatic diplomacy. The argument is that the international community, especially those neutral global powers, absolutely must unite to prioritize mutual security over hegemony. Because honestly, the strategy of military force hasn't brought stability at all. It's just birthed a highly volatile, multi-front war.
So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on. If military force, regime change tactics, and ceasefire violations only seem to birth uncontrollable, multi-front wars that end up crushing the global economy, what is it going to take for the international community to finally enforce real strategic restraint? It's a huge question and one that demands some deep reflection as we look at the incredibly fragile future of global economic and political stability. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and as always, keep questioning the deeper layers of the information around you.